Mordecai and I would go through the scrolls written by Daniel, I am amazed at how close he was to God and at the detailed visions he was given. Looking back now, his writing very accurately predicted the history of the Gentile empires that ruled and reigned in the Middle East before Messiah and beyond. Then later, many skeptics believed that they were not really written by Daniel, but we know that is not true. Why, Yeshua himself quoted from the book of Daniel and called him a prophet. My name is Hadassah, but you know me as Esther, the queen of the Persian Empire. You may ask, how did Mordecai and I, being in Persia, end up with copies of Daniel's scrolls? In this session, you will find the answer. Hang on. Daniel's life story has many twists and turns. In the last session, I told you about Daniel's early life, how he and his friends were carried into captivity by the Babylonians when they first attacked the city of Jerusalem and were trained to serve King Nebuchadnezzar in his palace. With Yahweh's help, Daniel rose to the position of chief of magicians. When King Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, there was a great scramble for power and the throne. Now the king had one son and 2 daughters. His son, evil Merodach, ruled for 2 years but was overthrown by an army coup led by Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, Neriglissar. It was not long until he was ousted, and his son also tried to reign. But after 2 months of wrangling, the second son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, named Nabonidus, ended up with the throne. Nabonidus was a military leader, who then led his army to northern Arabia. Because he was absent most of the time, he decided to allow his own son, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, to share the throne with him. So this is how the young king Belshazzar came to be a co-regent of Babylon in 553 BC, just 9 years after the death of his maternal grandfather. In the meantime, Daniel, who was now 67 years old, was still doing business for the new king, but had been moved into a quieter role. While still living and working in the palace, it appeared he had no personal contact with Belshazzar, the king. However, God was not finished with Daniel yet. In the first year of Belshazzar, Daniel had an amazing vision by night. Because it was so significant, he immediately recorded the details. In his vision, the Great Sea or Mediterranean Sea was churned by the action of 4 winds or spirits. 4 beasts rose up out of the sea. The first beast was like a lion with an eagle's wings. The wings were plucked, and the beast was lifted up from earth and made to stand like a man. A man's heart was given to it. Mordecai and I, learning later from the text that these beasts represented empires or kingdoms, looked carefully at the text for clues. Which empire was the first beast? Then we got it. The winged lion was carved into the gates of Babylon. The first beast must represent the Babylonian Empire. The second beast was like a bear. It raised itself onto one side and had 3 ribs in the teeth of it. Because we knew that the Persians had taken over the Babylonian Empire, this one was easy for us to guess. The unbalanced bear represented the blending of 2 nations to create one empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. The 3 ribs in the bear's mouth were the 3 empires of the Persians had taken: Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. The third beast looked like a leopard with 4 bird wings on its back. The beast also had 4 heads, and it was given a dominating power. At the time, Mordecai and I had no way of knowing exactly which empire would follow ours. But the way things were going militarily, we had a guess. From heaven's perspective, we now know that this beast represented the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great. Coming from the west, he conquered all the known world at the time, and when he died, the empire was divided among his top 4 generals. The final beast resembled a monster more scary than any animal we were acquainted with. The beast was dreadful and terrible and had great iron teeth. It had 10 horns and was trampling everything in its contact. These 10 horns were 10 kings. As Daniel watched, a little horn began to grow, and as it did, 3 of the first horns or kings were plucked out by the roots or conquered by the little horn. The little horn had eyes like a man and was speaking pompous words against God. Again, we now know that this beast represented the Roman Empire. This Roman Empire is still powerful in different forms and on the earth in your day, and this vision represents what will happen in the future. The little horn was making war against the saints and winning. You call this powerful leader the Antichrist, and during the last days he will try to change the times and law, and for 3.5 years he will wage war against the saints of God and win. After seeing the 4 beasts, Daniel was given a glimpse into the heavenly court. Thrones were being put in place. The Ancient of Days, all in white, was seated on the throne of flames, and its wheels were burning fire. Thousands were around the throne ministering to the Lord. The court was seated, and the books were opened. This final beast was slain, and its body destroyed and burned. The other 3 beasts had their dominion taken away, but were allowed to live for a season and a time. As Daniel watched, the Son of Man came on the clouds of heaven, Yeshua the Messiah. His kingdom was given glory, dominion, and power over all peoples, nations, and languages forever. Yeshua's kingdom was given to the saints of the Most High. His kingdom was to be an everlasting kingdom, and all nations shall serve and obey him. As Daniel came out of the vision, his thoughts troubled him regarding it, but he kept the matter in his heart. 2 years later, Daniel had another vision. It was very similar to the first one, but gave more details. A part of this vision actually came true in my lifetime, 70 years after the vision was given to Daniel. This time, Daniel was taken in a dream to the palace in Shushan, where I live, in the province of Elam by the river Ulai. In physical terms, this is like being transported from Iraq to Iran. Susa is 230 miles east of the Babylon. Later, Susa was the main residence of the Persian kings, including Darius and Xerxes, my husband. In his vision, there was a ram and a goat. The ram, representing the guardian spirit of the Persian Empire, had 2 horns. They were both high on its head, but one was higher than the other. Remember, the Medes and the Persians blended to create the Medo-Persian Empire, the bear of the first vision. This ram was pushing from the river Ulai in Persia to the west and north and south. And in real life, my husband King Xerxes was the leader of a great western campaign for our army. Actually, he was the higher horn on the head of the ram. He wanted to expand our empire into Greece and the rest of Europe, but was defeated at Thermopylae. Our entire Persian fleet was destroyed by the Greeks. I wish I had been able to share Daniel's prophecy with Xerxes before it happened, but I was not yet queen at the time. I was not able to warn him. He was so despondent when he returned from war, and this was the very moment he chose me as his queen for such a time as this. But how I've digressed into my own story. Let me continue. The male goat with 1 large horn, who was figuratively the same beast as the leopard in the first dream, represented the Greeks and Alexander the Great. The 1-horned goat had long been the symbol of the ancient Macedonians. Their army seemed to be moving so fast toward the Persian attack that their feet did not even touch the ground. The goat, or the Greek army, decimated the ram, or the Persian army, and was trampled down. Years later, Alexander the Great died in the city of Babylon at the age of 32. As I mentioned earlier, Alexander's kingdom was then divided upon his 4 generals. In the vision, Daniel saw the single horn Alexander break and 4 notable horns rise up representing his 4 generals. In the dream, the most notable of those horns or generals grew strongly toward the south, east, and the land of Judah and Israel. And while in Judea, this leader supernaturally rose up to heaven and took with him some of the host of heaven. He exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. The sanctuary of Yahweh was desecrated, and he cast truth to the ground. He did all this and prospered, and he was allowed by God to do this for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Again, looking at history, one of Alexander's generals, Seleucid, who was given Syria and the lands east to India. One infamous Seleucid emperor, Antiochus IV, known by the Hebrews as the Madman, came into power and defeated Egypt. He called himself the Illustrious One, and while in Jerusalem he did much harm to the Jewish people. He stopped the daily sacrifices, profaned the Sabbaths and feasts, and forced them to follow foreign customs in the land. Altars for idol worship were built and were used for unclean animals, including pigs. In a sense, he was trying to totally change their culture. Anyone who would not comply would be killed, and in fact it was about 6.5 years that Antiochus ruled Jerusalem, before the Jews were able to overthrow him and drive out the Syrian army. Judas Maccabeus, a Jewish priest, led the rebellion and took back the temple. They cleansed the temple and rededicated it after the desecration, and the Jews still celebrate this event as Hanukkah. All of a sudden, after seeing the vision and seeking the meaning in his mind, an angel in human form appeared to Daniel. It was Gabriel. A voice from heaven, directing Gabriel, explained the vision to Daniel, and what he revealed to him was amazing. The vision was for the end of time. While we can now see that this prophecy seemed to be fulfilled once already by Antiochus IV, it will be fulfilled again in the last days. In those coming days, a king will rise who understands sinister schemes. He will be mighty, but not by his own power. He will destroy the mighty on earth and also God's people, Israel. Through his cunning, he will cause deceit to prosper under his rule. Full of pride, he will destroy the prosperous on earth and rise against Jesus, Yeshua himself. His power will be broken by God, not man, and the vision of 2,300 days will be true again. And then Daniel was told to seal up the vision. It was many days into the future. As you can imagine, after all this, Daniel fainted and was sick for days. What an experience. Afterward, he went back to the king's business, still trying to consider all the vision meant. 12 more years went by, and during this time, Daniel, who was now 81 years old, was still living in the palace, but he was in retirement. Now the young co-regent of Babylon, Belshazzar, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and as he tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring out the gold and silver vessels which his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem almost 70 years ago, so that his guests might drink from them. Do you remember what happened next? That is right. Right in the middle of the banquet, fingers of a man's hand appeared and began to write a message on the plaster of the wall. None of the king's wise men could read it, but then the queen hurried into the banquet hall, most likely Belshazzar's mother. She reminded Belshazzar about Daniel. Daniel was brought before the king and proceeded to give him a message from Yahweh. The young king, God said, had not humbled his heart before him. Belshazzar should have known to honor Yahweh because he had the benefit of learning from what his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had testified. He also had angered God because in his pride he had brought out the sacred vessels from the temple in Jerusalem and used them as drinking vessels for his party. Finally, Daniel interpreted the message of the writing, and in modern terms, here is what it said. Belshazzar, your number is up. I have judged you, and you have been found wanting. Your kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Indeed, this message from Yahweh came true. That very night, while the banquet was going on, King Cyrus's army, under the direction of his general, diverted the river that circled the city of Babylon like a moat. The army of Persia walked right into Babylon and took the city by surprise and without a fight. King Cyrus himself arrived 17 days later on October 12, 539 BC. Daniel was there to meet him, of course, and this was my people's chance. This is what they had been waiting for. He presented King Cyrus with a scroll of Isaiah 45, written 150 years earlier. Isaiah's prophecy named Cyrus as the king who would allow the people of Yahweh to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Cyrus, the king of the newly united Medo-Persian Empire, was stirred in his heart by the words of Yahweh. Things were looking up. The first great beast of Daniel's vision, the great lion with wings, was no more. The Babylonian Empire had fallen. How excited the Jewish exiles must have been when they learned that the name of their Persian emperor was Cyrus. It was only a short time until their 70 years of captivity would be over, and they would be allowed to go home. The words of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, as well as other prophets, had come true, and were continuing to light the path of the Jewish remnant into the future, stirring them with hope.